Introducing. Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath in, and let it go. Let your body sink a little deeper into whatever surface is holding you right now. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, from your chest, from your hands. You don't need to hold on to anything tonight. You can let it all go. Take another breath in and out. Tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the noise and the rush of everyday life, somewhere where the only sounds are the low hum of the wind, the soft crash of ocean waves, and the slow turning of a great old light. We're going to a lighthouse. It sits on the edge of a rocky cliff, on a small island off the northern coast, the kind of place that most people only ever see in paintings or dreams, the kind of place where time moves differently, chairs slower, gentler, so like honey dripping from a spoon. You are safe here, you are warm, and tonight, all you have to do is listen. Let your eyes grow heavy, let your breathing slow, and let me tell you the story of the Lonely Lighthouse Keeper. Arrival. His name was Edmund Coway, and he had lived alone in the lighthouse for 11 years. He had come to the island in the autumn of his 42nd year, after a long life in the city had worn him down to something thin and tired. He had been a librarian once, in a great stone building in the heart of a busy town. He had loved the books, loved the quiet corners and the smell of old pages, but even that quiet had eventually been too loud for him. So he had answered an advertisement in the back of a nautical gazette. A lighthouse keeper was needed, experience preferred but not required, must be comfortable with solitude. Edmund had read those last 4 words and felt something loosen in his chest. Must be comfortable with solitude. He had thought, yes, I think I am. And so he had packed his things. True, not many things. He had never been a man of many things. True, and he had taken a ferry to the island, and then a small wooden boat to the rocky shore below the cliff, and he had climbed the steep path with his bag over one shoulder, and arrived, breathless and windswept, at the door of the lighthouse. It was painted white, though the paint was peeling in places. The tower rose high above him, perhaps 20 meters, built of pale stone that had been worn smooth by decades of salt wind. At the very top, just visible against the grey autumn sky, was the great glass lantern room where the light lived. Edmund had stood at the base of that tower for a long moment, looking up. The old keeper, Sue, a man named Hamish, who was retiring after 30 years on the island. Sue had come out to meet him. Hamish was small and weathered, with a face like driftwood, and eyes the colour of the sea on a cloudy day. "You must be the new one," Hamish had said. "I am," Edmund had said. Hamish had looked him up and down slowly, the way a sailor looks at the sky before deciding whether to go out. "You'll do," he said at last. "Come inside, I'll show you the light." That first evening, Hamish had walked Edmund through everything. The mechanism of the great lens gives so a beautiful, intricate thing of glass and brass, called a Fresnel lens, that turned the light into a sweeping beam visible for 20 miles in every direction. The clockwork motor that rotated it, which needed to be wound every 4 hours. The logbook, where every night was recorded, weather conditions, visibility, any ship spotted, any signals sent or received. The most important thing, Hamish had said, setting both hands flat on the logbook, is the light. Whatever else happens, GA, so storm, sickness, fog so thick you can't see your own hand, go the light must turn. Ships depend on it. People depend on it. You understand? I understand, Edmund had said. Good. Hamish had closed the logbook. The second most important thing is this. He had walked Edmund to the kitchen window, which looked out over the cliff's edge toward the open sea. The sun was going down somewhere behind the clouds, painting the water in shades of pewter and pale gold. Every evening, Hamish had said, before you light the lamp, you stand at this window for 5 minutes and you look at the sea. You don't think about anything. You just look. Is that in the official handbook? Hamish had almost smiled. No, but it's in mine. Hamish had left the next morning, climbing down the rocky path with his small bag and his 30 years of solitude packed quietly inside him. And Edmund had watched a little wooden boat carry him away until it was just a dot on the grey water, and then nothing at all. He had stood on the cliff for a long time after that. The wind had come in off the sea, cold and sharp and tasting of salt. Somewhere below, the waves had broken against the rocks with a sound like a slow, steady drumbeat. The grass on the cliff top, coast bars, tough, bent permanently sideways by the prevailing wind. Co had whispered around his ankles. Edmund had breathed in, and for the first time in a very long time, he had felt something that might have been peace, the rhythm of days. The lighthouse had its own rhythm, and Edmund learned it quickly. He woke before dawn in the small bedroom on the second floor, in a narrow iron bed with a thick woolen blanket. The room smelled of lanolin and old wood, and, faintly, of the sea through the single round window, cut so porthole-shaped, rimmed with brass, cut so he could see the first pale light beginning to spread across the eastern horizon. He would lie there for a few minutes, not quite asleep and not quite awake, listening to the sounds of the building around him. The lighthouse breathed. That was how Edmund thought of it. The wind pressed against the stone walls, and the building exhaled through the gaps around windows and doors, a low, intermittent sigh, like something dreaming. Then he would rise, dress in his thick wool trousers and heavy fisherman's sweater, and go downstairs to the kitchen. The kitchen was the warmest room in the lighthouse, heated by a cast iron stove that Edmund kept banked all night and stoked back to life each morning. He would fill the kettle from the cistern, curls of rainwater, collected in a great barrel outside Curl, and set it on the stove to boil. While he waited, he would look out the kitchen window at the sea. He did this every morning now, not just evenings. He hadn't meant to. It had simply happened. One grey dawn, when he had been waiting for the kettle and had turned to look and had found himself unable to look away. The sea was never the same twice. That was the thing he hadn't expected. He had thought before coming here that the sea would be monotonous, just water, just waves, the same, day after day. But it wasn't. Some mornings, the water was flat and glassy as a mirror, reflecting the pale pink of the dawn sky, so calm it seemed impossible that anything as powerful as the ocean lay beneath that surface. Other mornings, the waves came in tall and green-black, crashing against the rocks below, with a sound that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. There were days when the sea was the color of pewter, days when it was the color of jade, days when it was the shifting, uncertain blue of a winter sky. Edmund began to keep a second logbook, just for himself, not the official one, where he recorded visibility and weather and shipping movements. A small notebook with a soft brown cover where he wrote down what the sea looked like each morning. January 4th. Sea, the color of old mirrors. Flat, with a slow ground swell moving through it like breathing. The horizon invisible in the mist. The world feels very small today. January 9th. Sea, green and white and violent. Waves 12 feet, possibly more. The spray reaching almost to the top of the cliff. The sound like continuous thunder. I feel very safe in here. January 17th. Sea. I don't have a word for this color, between blue and grey and silver. The sun came through the clouds for about 20 minutes this afternoon, and the whole surface lit up like a field of diamonds. His days had a structure that he came to love. It was circular, of course, enclosed in glass on all sides, the great Fresnel lens at its center, like a jewel in a crown. During the day, the lens was still and dark, but even so, it caught the light in extraordinary ways. Joe sending small rainbows dancing across the walls, casting prismatic shadows, turning the plain white stone into something magical. Edmund would check the mechanism, make sure the clockwork was wound and the gears clean, wipe any salt spray from the glass panes. Then he would simply stand for a moment, looking out. From the lantern room, you could see for miles in every direction. The open sea to the north and west, stretching out to the horizon and beyond. The rocky shoreline of the mainland, just visible to the east on a clear day, a dark line between sky and water. The smaller islands scattered to the south, flat, treeless humps of rock, home only to seabirds. He could see the weather coming. From up there, he could watch a storm build from a distant smudge on the horizon, a darkening of the sky, a change in the color of the water, and know hours before it arrived exactly what kind of night it would be. Afternoons he spent reading or walking. He had brought books with him, so of course he had. He was a librarian, so packed carefully in a wooden crate that he kept beside the iron stove in the sitting room. Philosophy, poetry, natural history, novels, a complete set of the Encyclopedia Britannica that he had rescued from a library clear out years ago. He read slowly, carefully, the way you eat a good meal, savoring each page. When the weather allowed, he walked. The island was not large. You could walk its circumference in about 2 hours at a leisurely pace. He came to know every inch of it, the place where a pair of fulmars nested each spring in a crack in the cliff face, the smooth, flat rock near the western point, where seals hauled themselves out on calm days, lying in great grey heaps, their eyes half closed, entirely indifferent to his presence. The small hollow in the land near the North Shore, sheltered from the wind, where in summer a surprising variety of wildflowers managed to grow. He walked in all weathers, except the very worst storms. He had learned to layer his clothing, cur, a thermal undershirt, wool shirt, thick sweater, oilskin jacket, cur, and with his waterproof trousers and rubber boots, he could stay comfortable even in heavy rain. The wind was the only thing that sometimes defeated him, days when it came screaming in off the Atlantic with such force that he could barely stand upright. On those days he stayed inside, reading by the stove, listening to the lighthouse breathe, the sea in all its moods. There was a storm in his second winter that Edmund would remember for the rest of his life. It came from the northwest, announced 3 days early by a strange stillness in the air and a reddening of the evening sky. Then the barometer began to fall. He checked it every morning, tapping the glass lightly with one finger, chur dropping faster than he had ever seen it drop. The night before the storm arrived, the sea was extraordinary, swept around and around above his head, throwing its arc of light out across the darkening sea. He thought about the sailors who might be out there. He hoped there were none, but if there were, he wanted them to see his light, wanted them to know where the rocks were, wanted to reach across all that dark water with something warm and steady and say, here is where the land is, here is where the danger is. You are not alone. He wound the clockwork, he checked the mechanism, he watched the storm come in. It hit just after midnight. The sound of it woke him from a half sleep in his chair in the lantern room. Not the wind, God so. He had been hearing the wind build for hours. It was the change in the wind, the sudden dramatic shift in its register, from a howl to something deeper, more fundamental, a sound that you felt in your bones rather than heard with your ears. The lighthouse shuddered. Edmund had not known a building could shudder until that night. The stone walls of the tower were enormously thick, so 1 meter or more at the base, tapering only slightly toward the top. And yet, in the grip of that storm, they trembled. Not enough to be dangerous, not enough to threaten the structure, but enough to feel if you pressed your palm flat against the wall. He pressed his palm against the wall. He could feel the storm through the stone, the percussion of the waves against the cliff far below, the pressure of the wind against the glass. The lighthouse breathed in short, sharp gasps. Edmund sat in his chair and kept watch, and the light turned and turned and turned. By morning, the worst of it had passed. He climbed down the spiral stair, his legs stiff and his eyes gritty from the long night, and went to the kitchen. He boiled the kettle. He looked out the window at the sea. The waves were still enormous. So would be for another day or two as the energy of the storm worked its way through the water. But the sky was beginning to clear. The cloud was breaking up in the northwest, showing strips of pale blue. Edmund wrapped both hands around his tea mug and looked at the sea and felt, quite unexpectedly, grateful. not for anything specific, not for the end of the storm, or for the safety of the lighthouse, or for the warmth of the stove behind him, just grateful for being here, for being alive, for the extraordinary privilege of existing in this world, on this island, at the edge of this immense and ancient sea. He stood there for a long time. Then he opened his brown notebook and wrote, "The storm has passed. The sea is exhausted, and so am I. But there is light on the water this morning, the first real light in 3 days, and everything looks washed clean. I am very glad to be here." Visitors. In 11 years on the island, Edmund had relatively few visitors. The supply boat came once a fortnight, weather permitting, from the mainland. It brought food, KC staples, mostly the things that kept: flour, oats, dried beans, tinned vegetables, coffee, tea, fresh vegetables when the season allowed, occasionally a letter. The man who drove the supply boat was named Callum. He was young, Kern in his mid-20s when Edmund first arrived, broad-shouldered and cheerful, with a habit of whistling under his breath. Over the years, Callum had become the closest thing Edmund had to a friend. Their visits were brief, so an hour, sometimes 2, if the weather was good enough for Callum to tie up the boat and come up to the lighthouse for a cup of tea. They would sit in the kitchen and talk mostly about practical things: the weather, the sea conditions, the state of the mainland, the occasional piece of news that Callum thought Edmund might find interesting. Edmund was always glad to see him, but he was also, he noticed, always glad when he left. He had thought about this carefully in the way he thought about everything. He did not dislike people. He had simply arranged his interior life in such a way that solitude was its natural state. Company was welcome, even nourishing, but like rich food eaten occasionally, it was best taken in small portions. One spring afternoon in his 4th year on the island, Edmund had an unusual visitor. He was sitting on the flat rock near the western point, watching the seals, when he heard the sound of a small engine. He turned to see a little motorboat rounding the southern headland, moving slowly, hugging the rocks. It putted to a stop near the small cove where Edmund kept his own dinghy. So a little rowing boat, used occasionally to row around the island on calm days, or to collect driftwood from the shore below the cliff. He watched as a figure climbed carefully out of the motorboat and pulled it up onto the shingle. The figure began to climb the path toward the lighthouse. Edmund rose from his rock and went to meet them. She was perhaps 60, he thought, as she came closer, small and quick-moving, with white hair cut short and wind-brightened cheeks. She wore a canvas jacket covered in pockets and carried a large rucksack on her back and a battered notebook in one hand. "Hello," she called when she was still 20 yards away. "I hope I'm not trespassing." "Not officially," Edmund said. "There's no sign." He laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and unself-conscious. "I'm a botanist," she said, holding out her hand when she reached him. "Miriam Holt, from the University in Edinburgh. I'm doing a survey of the island's flora. I wrote to the Lighthouse Authority. They said I might find you here and that you wouldn't mind." "I don't mind," Edmund said, which was true. To his mild surprise, Edmund Calloway, the lighthouse keeper, the lighthouse keeper. She looked up at the tower with undisguised delight. What a wonderful building. May I see inside? He showed her the lighthouse, from the kitchen to the lantern room, and she was interested in all of it. So not politely interested, but genuinely, actively curious, asking questions, peering at things, occasionally taking notes. She was particularly taken with the Fresnel lens, which she circled several times, exclaiming softly at the way it caught the light. "It's like a cathedral," she said. "All this glass and light." Edmund looked at the lens as if seeing it for the first time. "I suppose it is," he said. She spent 2 days on the island, camping near the southern shore. Each evening she came to the lighthouse for dinner. Sir Edmund cooked simple things, but good ones. Bread baked in the Dutch oven and thick vegetable soup from his larder stores. They talked easily about botany and books and the island, about the mainland and the university and the state of the world beyond this stretch of sea. When she left, Edmund stood on the cliff top and watched her little boat until it rounded the headland and disappeared. He went back to the lighthouse and sat in the kitchen for a while. He felt the quiet settle around him again, like a familiar garment. And it did feel familiar, comfortable, right? But he noticed that evening that he was smiling. The light. There was something Edmund had never told anyone about the light. He had tried once to describe it to Callum, and the words had come out wrong. Cursor, sentimental, or mystical, or just strange. So he had stopped and talked about something else, and the thing had remained inside him, unspoken. This was it. The light was alive. Not literally. He was not a superstitious man. He knew it was a mechanism, a set of gears, and a bulb, and a glass lens turning in the darkness. He understood it completely, mechanically. He could take the whole system apart and put it back together blindfolded. But on certain nights, when the visibility was very low, so dense fog or heavy rain, so the beam of the lighthouse would catch the moisture in the air and do something extraordinary. It would not merely shine out into the darkness, it would seem to hang there, visible from within the lantern room, as a great sweeping column of luminous air moving in slow arcs above the sea. On those nights, watching the beam from above, Edmund felt something he could not quite name. It was something like purpose, something like connection, the light reaching out across the dark water toward ships he couldn't see, toward people he didn't know, a wordless message sent into the darkness. Here is where I am. Here is where it is safe. He had been a librarian for 20 years. He had spent his life among books, surrounded by the recorded thought of centuries of human beings reaching across time to speak to one another. He had always felt that this was meaningful guide, so that the act of writing, of reading, of preserving knowledge was a kind of conversation that transcended the ordinary limits of time and space. The lighthouse was another version of that conversation. not in words, in light. And on those foggy nights, standing in the lantern room with the great beam sweeping around him, Edmund felt genuinely, deeply, quietly happy. The seasons. Spring came to the island slowly, reluctantly, as if it had been on a long journey and was tired when it arrived. First the light changed, so the days lengthening, the quality of the afternoon sun shifting from the flat grey-white of winter to something softer, warmer, more golden. Then the birds began to return. The puffins came first, arriving suddenly one calm April morning by the hundreds, settling on the cliff tops and the rocky ledges like small formal visitors, standing upright with their orange feet and their painted bills. Edmund loved the puffins. He spent long hours watching them with his binoculars, noting their behavior in his brown notebook. The way they carried fish back to their burrows in remarkable quantities. He had once counted 11 small fish held crossways in a single beak. Their underground burrows, which they returned to year after year, the same pairs to the same holes. Their apparent indifference to his presence, which he took as a compliment. The wildflowers came next. The hollow on the north side of the island filled up with thrift and sea campion first. The thrift a bright pink, like small pom-poms on wiry stems. The campion white and delicate. Then sea mayweed and bird's foot trefoil, and later in the summer, the extraordinary spires of grass of Parnassus, creamy white, delicately veined with green, cakes so that appeared near the damp patches near the old well. Edmund photographed them all. He had a small camera purchased in the second year, and he documented the island's flora through all its seasons, building up a record that Miriam Holt, when she returned for a second survey several years later, declared to be genuinely useful to science. He had liked that, to be useful to science. He had not expected, becoming a lighthouse keeper, that he would make any particular contribution to knowledge, but here, on this small island, in this quiet life, he was making one. The observation, sustained over years, of one small piece of the world. Summer evenings were the longest and most beautiful. The sun set somewhere around 10 o'clock in a prolonged, gradual fading that began hours earlier, with the sky turning to shades of copper and rose. Edmund would often sit on the cliff top until the last of the light was gone, wrapped in a blanket against the chill that came even on summer nights this far north. The sea would be calm, usually, in summer, glassy on the still evenings, breathing slowly. The sound of the waves a long, soft hiss, rather than the crash and thunder of winter. Distant now, the horizon, which in winter seemed close, pressed in by cloud and spray, in summer retreated to an improbable distance, the curve of the earth itself becoming visible. He would sit and watch the colors change, copper to rose to pale gold, rose to violet, the first star appearing, usually in the east, followed by another and another, until the sky was fully itself, the Milky Way arching overhead, thick and bright in the unpolluted darkness of this remote place. Edmund knew the stars now. He had always been interested in astronomy. She had a basic knowledge, the kind you pick up from books. But living on the island had deepened it. He had bought a good pair of binoculars in his first year and a small telescope in his third. And on clear nights, he spent hours on the cliff top, working his way through the sky. He found the practice deeply calming. There was something about the scale of it, the distances involved in looking at the night sky were so incomprehensible, so far beyond the reach of ordinary imagination, that the act of contemplating them produced a particular kind of peace. The ordinary concerns of daily life cool, so the small anxieties for minor difficulties so diminished to their proper size in comparison. You could not worry about small things while looking at the stars. Autumn came with storms, not the dramatic winter storms. Those came later. But their advance guard. Days of strong wind and driving rain, the sea throwing up heavy swells, the barometer falling and rising in a kind of restless indecision, the birds leaving, the flowers dying back, the island returning to its winter colors, the brown of dead grass, the gray of rock, the dark green of the few hardy plants that kept their leaves through the cold. Edmund liked autumn best, he thought. There was a melancholy to it that he found beautiful rather than sad. The shortening days and the emptying of the island of its summer life felt like a kind of settling, a return to essentials. The world stripping itself back to its bare structure, the way you might strip a complicated piece of machinery down to its components. To understand how it worked, he did some of his best reading in autumn. Long days by the stove, the wind outside, a book in his lap, the teapot keeping warm on the back burner. He worked his way through the Encyclopedia Britannica one autumn, starting at A and reading through to Z over the course of 3 months, covering everything from aardvarks to Zoroastrianism, filling his brown notebook with observations and questions and connections. He had always been curious, but the lighthouse had made him more so. When your world is small and your time abundant, curiosity becomes a way of life. Small things. In his 7th year, Edmund discovered that a family of otters lived in the rocks below the northern cliff. He had suspected it for some time. Xo had seen signs, the occasional half-eaten fish on a flat rock, the prints in the mud near the stream that came down from the higher ground. Then, one November morning, looking down from the cliff path, he saw them, a female and 2 young ones, playing in a pool among the boulders, rolling and diving and shaking the water from their faces. He lay down on the cliff top and watched for over an hour. The otters did not notice him or did not care. They played with an entirely natural, unconscious joy, calm it so, not aware of any audience, simply doing what otters do in the places where otters live, chasing each other, floating on their backs, wrestling briefly, then separating, then coming together again. Edmund watched and felt something rise in his chest that he could only describe as love, not for these particular otters, so he didn't know them, but for the fact of them, for their existence, unknowing in this remote and beautiful place that the long, unbroken chain of otters that had lived here, probably for thousands of years, doing exactly this. He went back the next day, and the day after that. The otters were there most mornings. Over time, he came to recognize them. KCL, CO could tell the female from the cubs, and eventually, as the cubs grew, could tell them apart from each other. He named them in his notebook, though he would have been embarrassed to say so aloud. Hector, Agnes, and the smaller one he called Wren. Wren was his favorite. She was the bolder of the two cubs, more likely to climb higher on the rocks, more likely to investigate things. She had a notch in her left ear, so a minor injury from some early adventure, so that made her unmistakable. He watched them for 3 years, until the cubs were grown and dispersed and the female appeared alone. Then, one spring, she arrived with new cubs, and the whole thing began again. He never told anyone about the otters. They were his. There was a particular evening in his 9th year that Edmund thought of often afterward. He had climbed to the lantern room at dusk, as he did every evening, to light the lamp. The weather had been unsettled all day, not stormy, but grey and restless, the clouds moving fast, the sea ruffled and dark. He had expected more of the same, but when he emerged into the lantern room, he found the sky had changed. The clouds had broken in the west, torn apart by the wind into great irregular shreds, and behind them the sunset had come through. So, an extraordinary sunset, the kind he had seen maybe 3 times in 9 years. The whole western sky was on fire, deep orange at the horizon, shading up through red and crimson and purple, reflected in the sea below so that the water itself seemed to be burning. He stood very still and looked at it. The light changed as he watched, as it always does at sunset, each moment different from the one before. The colors deepened, the purple spreading further across the sky, and then, in the east, he saw the thing that sometimes happens after remarkable sunsets at sea, the sky turning a strange, luminous green, just for a moment, just at the horizon, before the darkness came. He lit the lamp. The great beam began to turn, steady and sure, its rhythm unchanged by the extraordinary sky around it. Edmund thought, "I am the luckiest man on earth." He did not mean fortunate in the conventional sense. He did not have many things. He was not wealthy, not well known, not connected to the great networks of influence and importance that seem to govern most people's lives. He had a small stone building on a small island at the edge of the Atlantic, and a light to keep, and a sea to watch, but he was here. He was awake to this particular evening, this particular sky, this impossible orange light pouring across the water. He was paying attention. That, he had come to believe, was the whole of it, the purpose of a life, or at least of his life, to be here and to notice. Letters. Twice a year, Edmund wrote long letters to his sister in Glasgow. She was 4 years older, a retired school teacher, and they had always been close, despite their very different lives. He told her about the island, the weather, the birds. She sent him news of the family, her children, her grandchildren, the gradual, ordinary accumulation of births and marriages and losses that constituted a life lived in the world. And to an old friend from his library days, a man named Bernard, who had gone on to write several books and who always wrote back at considerable length, letters that sprawled across 6 or 8 pages of cramped handwriting and covered philosophy and literature and the state of the world with tremendous enthusiasm. Edmund looked forward to these letters more than he could easily say. They arrived with Callum, tucked into a rubber-banded packet, along with any catalogues or notices from the Lighthouse Authority. He would take them upstairs and sit by the window of his bedroom and read them carefully, all at once, and then read them again, more slowly, stopping at sentences that seemed important. His sister's letters smelled faintly of her kitchen, so something herbal, rosemary or thyme, and were written in her firm, schoolteacher's hand, the letters neat and even. Bernard's were chaotic, crossing from margin to margin, full of corrections and insertions, and little drawings in the corners when he wanted to illustrate a point. Edmund kept all of them in a shoebox under the bed. He did not think of himself as a lonely man, but the shoebox mattered to him. The letters mattered. The knowledge that somewhere beyond the sea, in the warm and complicated world, people thought of him and wrote to him and wanted to know what the sea looked like this morning. It was enough. It was more than enough. What the sea said, Edmund believed, though he never said this aloud, that the sea had things to tell him. Not in words. The sea didn't deal in words. It dealt in moods and colors and sounds, in the particular way the light fell on the water at different times of day and different times of year, in the patterns of the waves and the behavior of the wind, in the things that washed up on the shore. He had found remarkable things on the shore over the years. Glass fishing floats, the old kind, round and green, that had travelled from fishing boats in distant waters. A single wooden clog, perfectly preserved. Pieces of rope and net and timber. A bottle with a handwritten note inside, which he had opened carefully. It contained what appeared to be a love letter in a language he couldn't identify, signed with initials he couldn't read. He had kept the note. It was in the shoebox with the letters. He found, on a stormy February morning, the body of a large northern gannet, cur, a beautiful bird, white with black wingtips and a golden head, one of the finest flyers in the North Atlantic. It had died in the storm, or before it. It lay on the rocks at the bottom of the cliff, wings spread slightly, eyes closed, perfectly intact. Edmund had climbed down and stood looking at it for a long time. He thought about the distances gannets travelled, thousands of miles, from their breeding colonies in the north to their wintering grounds far to the south. He thought about this particular bird. So this exact gannet, this individual creature with its particular history, its particular life. So, and about the fact that it had ended here, on this rock, on this island, on this morning. He buried it in the hollow where the wildflowers grew. He didn't examine this impulse. It seemed right, and that was enough. The sea taught him about time, not the human kind of time. Cow, sir. The clock measured, calendar-marked time of appointments and schedules and ages and anniversaries. The other kind, geological time, the time of tides and seasons, of erosion and deposition, of the slow reshaping of coastlines over millennia. The rocks below the lighthouse were ancient. He knew this from his reading. Granite and gneiss, some of the oldest stone in the British Isles, formed in the deep geological past when this part of the earth was somewhere very different. So, perhaps nearer the equator, perhaps under a shallow sea, the exact circumstances lost in the incomprehensible distance of time. He stood on those rocks sometimes, on calm mornings, and tried to hold the scale of it in his mind. He was standing on something that had formed 400 million years ago. Under his boots, compressed time, the whole of human history. Joe, every civilization, every invention, every war, and every work of art. Joe, so, was a thin, recent scratch on the surface of something immeasurably old. This did not make him feel small exactly. It made him feel appropriately sized, as if the ordinary business of being human, the worrying and hoping and trying, was exactly the right scale for a human being. No larger than that, and no smaller. He was what he was. He was here. He was paying attention. That was enough. The night watch. At 11 o'clock each night, Edmund climbed to the lantern room to wind the clockwork. This was the last thing he did before bed, and often the thing he liked best. The island would be dark by then, the sky fully settled into night. The beam of the lighthouse swept in its patient arcs overhead. The sea was a sound more than a sight, so the regular percussion of the waves, the occasional deeper boom, as a particularly large one met the cliff face. He would wind the mechanism, see a practiced motion now, requiring almost no thought, see and then stand for a few minutes at the glass, looking out, the stars on clear nights, the moonlight on the water, the running lights of distant ships moving slowly across the darkness, tiny red and green points of light, accompanied sometimes by a white masthead light above them. He would watch them and wonder about them, where they were going, what they were carrying, who was at the wheel on this particular night. He always waved. He knew they couldn't see him. Yet so, the lighthouse beam was too bright, the distance too great, the ships too focused on their navigation. But he waved anyway, a small raising of one hand directed at each set of running lights as it crossed his field of view. He couldn't have said why. It simply felt right to acknowledge them, to say with a small, unseen gesture, "I see you. I am here. You are not alone on the dark water." 11 years. In the autumn of his 11th year on the island, Edmund received a letter from the lighthouse authority. He recognized the envelope, the official crest, the typewritten address. He had received letters from them before, mostly routine administrative matters. He opened it expecting the same. He read it twice, then he put it on the kitchen table and went to stand at the window and look at the sea. The letter informed him that the lighthouse was to be automated. This had been happening for years, so he knew it, had known it was coming. So the gradual automation of lighthouses all around the coast, their mechanisms upgraded to run without a keeper, their light maintained by remote monitoring and occasional maintenance visits. It was more efficient. Of course, it was more efficient. He would be offered a relocation package, the letter said, a pension, which he was nearly eligible for anyway, assistance finding new accommodation. The authority wished to thank him for his 11 years of service, which had been exemplary. Edmund stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Then he sat down at the table and picked up the letter again and read it a third time. The sea looked the same as it always had, grey this morning with a low swell from the northwest, a few whitecaps visible in the distance, a gannet hunting cur. So he watched it fold its wings and plunge, a white arrow, into the water and emerge with something silver in its bill. He was 63 years old. He had spent 11 years on this island, which meant he had spent more of his middle age here than anywhere else. He could not entirely imagine what his life had looked like before. A library in a city somewhere, noise and crowds, and the daily performance of ordinary sociality. He had been unhappy there, or not quite happy. He had not known until he came here what being happy looked like, what it felt like in the body. This particular feeling, this steadiness, this sense of being exactly where you were supposed to be. He would have to leave that. He would have to go back to the world. He sat with this for a while. Then he opened his brown notebook and wrote, "The lighthouse is to be automated. I am to leave in the spring. I find that I am sad, but not devastated. The light will still turn. That is the most important thing. The light will still turn. I have been here 11 years, and I have learned a few things. I have learned to look at the sea. I have learned to be quiet. I have learned that small things attended to carefully and over time reveal something that I can only call truth. The otter in the pool, the puffin on the cliff, the way the light looks on the water at the end of a long October afternoon. I don't know what I'll do next. I suppose I'll find out. The habit of looking, the practice of noticing, the knowledge that wherever you are, the world is offering you something worth paying attention to. That's what the island taught me. That's what the light taught me. It's enough. The light still turns." Edmund left the island the following April. Callum came with an extra boat, Xo a larger one. Borrowed Xo to take his things. Edmund had not accumulated much in 11 years, but he had accumulated something. The shoebox of letters, the stack of brown notebooks, the small telescope, the books, the camera and its folders of photographs. He stood on the cliff for the last time on his last morning. The sea was calm. The sun was up, already warm on his face. Sure, it was going to be a good day, the kind of clear blue spring day that this coast offered occasionally, like a gift. The fulmars were back in their nesting spots on the cliff face. Far out, he could see the shapes of gannets fishing. He turned and looked at the lighthouse. It stood as it always had, white and solid, the glass of the lantern room catching the morning sun. Inside, the mechanism ran on its new automated schedule. No human hand required to wind it. The light would come on at dusk. The beam would turn. The ships would see it. He pressed one hand flat against the cool stone of the tower. He could not feel the clockwork through the stone. Not now, not in daylight with everything still. But he knew it was there. He picked up his bag. He walked down the cliff path toward the shore. He did not look back. He lives now in a small town on the mainland coast. He has a cottage with a window that looks out toward the sea, which on clear days he can just see between the rooftops, so a thin slice of blue-grey water at the end of the street. He walks to the seafront most mornings. He has a membership at the local library, where he volunteers one afternoon a week. He has started a new brown notebook, and sometimes, on clear nights, he goes to the seafront and looks out across the water to where he knows, about 6 miles offshore, a small, rocky island sits. On that island, a white tower stands, and at the top of that tower, every night, without fail, a light turns, slowly, patiently, steadily, reaching out across the dark water with something warm and sure, saying, "Here is where the rocks are. Here is where it's safe. You are not alone. And now, wherever you are, in whatever quiet or warmth or darkness you have found yourself tonight, I hope you feel that too. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. The waves are coming in, soft and steady, one after another, the way they always have. You are safe. You are warm. You can rest now. Good night."